Today we're unboxing a third generation iPad that I purchased on eBay as open box. And this one has a really interesting backstory. Let's go ahead and get it opened up. And here we have the iPad. As you can see, this is in a very non-traditional cardboard box. So that's where the interesting story comes into play. According to the seller, this iPad was purchased by a school but never used. So you can see this sticker on the box here that would have traditionally been on a retail box for the iPad. I never knew that iPads sold to education markets did not include that retail packaging. But I guess it makes sense as this would really help save space with shipping. So I will carefully cut the tape on this box. And here we have the iPad in its original plastic wrapper. I do see some very light wear to this, I assume from this plastic rubbing against the cardboard over the years. And here is the back of the device. It looks like some debris from that box might have made its way in. So let's go ahead and use this pull tab to release the iPad from its envelope. Okay, and unfortunately that was not a very satisfying sound at all. So let's slide this out now without touching the display. And here we go. It's a little bit difficult to tell if this display has ever been touched. I do see some slight smudges here, so hopefully the device was not removed from the plastic and updated. Let's connect it to a charger now. Okay, and after a troubling amount of time, we finally get the charging screen. In the 30 seconds it took for that screen to pop up, I was thinking the absolute worst. Anytime you purchase a device that has sat in a box for a really long amount of time, you're always concerned about the battery, as some batteries can easily go into a state of deep discharge if not used. This iPad was in a box for 13 years, so that was definitely a concern I had. So I'm going to leave the iPad now to charge up for several hours. Okay, and now we have the iPad powered up here. It powered on after being connected to the charger for about 45 minutes. And I've actually had it connected to this charger for about 5 hours now. And it's only at 79%. I was really trying to wait until it got to 100% before I really used the device. But I'm just too anxious to get this device set up. From this setup screen, I can definitely confirm that this is running iOS 5. First, just from the skeuomorphic design, we can tell that this is no newer than iOS 6. But the giveaway here that this is iOS 5 is the lock icon near the center of the top of the display. This lock icon was removed in iOS 6. So let's go through this iOS 5 setup. Okay, perfect. Looks like we got through activation. I must admit, I am still a little bit nervous where this iPad came from a school that we'll see something pop up relating to that. Here's an interesting screen in the setup regarding dictation. This dictation or speech to text feature was actually exclusive to the third generation iPad at the time. And here we go, we are met with the iOS 5 home screen. And there are tons of giveaways that this is iOS 5. iOS 5 was the last version to have this built-in YouTube application. It was also the last version to have Google Maps built in with this icon. And it was also the last version to use this older style settings icon. Let's jump into settings so we can see which version of iOS 5 we have. Okay, and it looks like we have the final revision here with 5.1.1. This third generation iPad was released about halfway into the iOS 5 lifecycle, so it only ever received 5.1 and 5.1.1. And relievingly, I don't see anything here in settings relating to the school that this iPad was purchased by. I believe on these older versions of iOS, you could have provisioning profiles that you would have a separate category for here in settings. But that is definitely not present here. Okay, and now I have the iPad here fully charged up to 100%. So let's talk about what this third generation iPad was. It was released in March 2012, a little over 1 year after the iPad 2. And it shared a lot with the 2011 iPad 2, including the design. But it did make some really important internal improvements. The most notable of which is the Retina display. So this iPad had a significantly sharper display than the previous two iPads. And just in case you weren't aware, Apple launched the Retina display in 2010 with the iPhone 4. And they got this name by the displays being so sharp that the retinas in your eye cannot distinguish individual pixels from a normal viewing distance. The iPhone and iPod Touch both received this feature in 2010. So the iPad was a little bit late to the game receiving it in 2012. Because this was still the same general design as the iPad 2, it was still a 9.7-inch panel. But it now had a resolution of 2048 by 1536. And that adds up to 3.1 million pixels, which was 4 times the amount that the iPad 2 had. So here's a look at the non-Retina display on the previous iPad 2. Especially with small details like the battery percentage, you can see that the screen appears a bit pixelated. But that was completely eliminated with this 3rd generation iPad. Everything was pin sharp. And here's a side-by-side comparison of these displays. I will say though, there doesn't appear to be a huge difference in the panels aside from resolution. The viewing angles and colors appear to be really similar, if not the same. And the 3rd generation's Retina display was still not laminated to the cover glass. But the sharpness of this display really made a huge positive impact on user experience. Certain use cases like reading books with fine text were much better on the 3rd generation iPad. This iPad did bring some new features alongside that Retina display. It had a new processor with the A5X chip, whereas the previous iPad 2 had a standard A5 chip. It was still a dual-core processor clocked at 1 GHz, but it now had quad-core graphics instead of dual-core. And that was really necessary to power the Retina display. It was also the first iOS device to feature a full 1 GB of RAM. It got a nice improvement to the rear camera. It was now a 5 megapixel sensor up from the sub 1 megapixel sensor on the iPad 2. It still had the same VGA quality front-facing camera though. As I mentioned earlier, it also brought the new dictation feature. Reportedly, this iPad had upgraded microphones that featured noise-canceling technology to allow this. Strangely though, this iPad did not initially receive the Siri feature that had just launched with the iPhone 4S. It would later receive that feature with the iOS 6 update in fall 2012. And although this iPad did share a design with the iPad 2, it was ever so slightly tweaked. To accommodate the Retina display, it was 0.8 millimeters thicker, and it was also around 50 grams heavier. There was also a huge increase to the battery size. It was now over 11,000 milliamp hours, whereas the iPad 2 had around 6,500 milliamp hours. It was rated for the same 10 hours of battery life though, so that extra capacity was needed to power the Retina display. This iPad launched at a price of $499 for a 16GB configuration. You could get higher tier configurations with 32 or 64 gigabytes. And you could also get a cellular model with 4G, although there was a bit of controversy about that. Apparently, those 4G speeds weren't able to be achieved everywhere, so Apple went to change the name from Wi-Fi and 4G to just Wi-Fi and cellular. It was only sold from March 2012 to October 2012 when it was replaced with the 4th generation iPad. So it was sold new for only 7 months. And for some users that had just purchased one of these shortly before the launch of the 4th generation in October, they were rightfully a bit upset, so some Apple stores went to extend their return policy to accommodate them. So now let's talk about iOS 5 on this iPad specifically. iOS 5 was advertised as having over 200 new features compared to iOS 4. And a lot of those really did make a huge difference in day-to-day use. I would say one of the most notable is iCloud. Of course, we're all familiar with what iCloud is today. But back when it launched, it was a huge advent to have all of your content sync seamlessly across all of your devices. And it really helped save users time from connecting their iOS devices to a computer to sync their content. iOS 5 also made a huge update to the notification system. You now had a centralized place for notifications called the Notification Center. Previously, this was just not available in iOS 4, so it was really easy to lose notifications as they had no centralized place to stay. It also brought banner-style notifications that would come up at the top of your screen rather than occupying the center and needing to be dismissed. iOS 5 brought iMessage, which was especially huge for iPad and iPod Touch users. And that's because you could send messages between iOS devices using only an email address and Wi-Fi. And of course, iMessage brought the supremacy that comes along with those blue message bubbles. It also had really nice features like delivery and read receipts, as well as the ability to know when who you were texting was typing. And iOS 5 had some more features that were especially great for users that did not have a computer. As you saw at the beginning of the video, you can set up a device running iOS 5 without connecting to a computer. With iOS 4 and older versions, you would have to connect to iTunes to do that activation process. And starting with iOS 5, you could have over-the-air updates. There were some new applications in this version like reminders and this newsstand folder. And there were some updates to the keyboard. On iPad, you could now do this gesture to split the keyboard. And this layout made typing on the iPad so much easier. To revert to the original setup, you can just simply swipe back together. Also, the emoji keyboard was now available in settings. With iOS 4 and previous versions, you would have to download an application from the App Store to activate this keyboard in settings. There were also some really cool multitasking gestures that launched with iOS 5 for the iPad. So you could pinch on the screen to return to the home screen. You could also swipe upward to access multitasking. And if you were in an application, you could swipe left or right to go between applications. Let's take a look at the default wallpaper selection here on iOS 5. This version has a really nice selection. There are 34 here to choose from. And it's pretty interesting because this was the default only for this third generation iPad on iOS 5. Installs of iOS 5 on any other device had this water droplet default wallpaper. And this selection feels really nostalgic because the following iOS version, iOS 6, removed many of these. I know these blue dots were not available in iOS 6 and newer, and neither was this flower, or this peacock feather, or this nostalgic globe image. This version also had the wallpaper from the original iPad. Another interesting piece of trivia about this iPad is that Apple actually did not refer to it as the third generation when it launched. They were rather really insistent on calling this the new iPad. But that pretty much concludes my look at this open box third generation iPad running iOS 5.1.1. I'm super pumped to have this iPad in my collection because this device on its original software has proved really difficult to find, at least for me. And I'm super glad that this device is fully working after sitting in a box for 13 years. I was definitely nervous about the battery's ability to hold charge after that long. And I was also pretty skeptical as this iPad did come from a school. So I definitely got lucky with no sort of locks present on this device. Be sure to get subscribed if you want to see more legacy iOS devices on their original software. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.